Llewellyn King, the host of White House Chronicle, which is coming right up. Today, a very special program. Seems to me that two things dominate our lives and our conversations. The speed with which technology is changing our lives, and the speed with which the Chinese economy has grown and its goods and services have affected our lives. To look at the Chinese economy, to look at China's place in the future and our place in relation to China, I have assembled today three great experts, and we're going to discuss China and America, and how they can get along in the future without some of the tensions that have been traditional when two large powers stand toe to toe in the world. We'll be right back with that fascinating discussion.
White House Chronicle is produced in collaboration with WHUT, Howard University Television. And now, the program host, nationally syndicated columnist Llewellyn King, and co-host Linda Gasparello.
Hello again, and thank you for coming along. When we have guests in Washington, we put them up at the American Guest House. This is a very fine bed and breakfast, somewhere between a bed and breakfast and a club. I think of it more as a club. It's very comfortable, it's very cozy. It has a lot of the attributes of staying in a private home or a club rather than a hotel or a bed and breakfast. Check it out when you're in Washington. The American Guest House, a good address and a good place to stay. I promised you three of the great experts on China, and it is my honor, indeed even a privilege, to have them here today. I'm joined by Robert Daly of the Wilson Center. Robert, welcome to the broadcast, and tell me a little bit about your expertise on China. I know you speak Chinese, and so you must know a great deal about the country.
Well, I started working in China as a diplomat in the late 80s. Spent about 11 years in country, working for the U.S. government twice, once for the Foreign Service.
In country, as diplomatic speak, for living there.
I'm sorry, living in China, yes, in Beijing, Nanjing, Shanghai, and Taipei. And in addition to working for government, have worked a lot with media groups in China, Chinese television and film, and worked for the Children's Television Workshop for a while, producing Chinese Sesame Street and other programs there as well.
That's
so
fascinating.
I'm interested in the politics, but also in the cultural side.
That's fantastic. And we are joined by our old friend on this program, Amitai Etzioni of the George Washington University. Nice to have you back on the broadcast.
Thank you.
And you have a keen interest in China.
Right. I know extremely little about China, but I spent the last 50 years studying the United States. And these days, it's of great concern how the United States is going to relate to China. So that's the way I got to the issue. So the American relationship to China, rather than just studying China itself.
And Jeffrey Bader, welcome to the broadcast. You're with the Brookings Institution, very famous think tank, probably the only think tank in Washington where they still think, the rest having entered the propaganda business. Tell me about your Chinese connection.
Well, I joined the State Department in 1975, and then through serendipity, I became staff assistant to Dick Holbrooke, who was then Assistant Secretary of State for Asian Affairs. His Asian incarnation.
Like a lot of journalists, I knew Holbrooke.
Yeah, he knew every journalist.
What a powerhouse of a man.
Extraordinary.
You know, he and Colin Powell are the two men I've known who, when they enter a room, they don't have to say anything. Something has happened. The dynamic has changed by the mere fact of their arrival. Well, unfortunately, Holbrooke's no longer with us.
No, it's a great loss.
So, and what did you do for him exactly?
I was a staff assistant, which meant he did whatever he wanted you to do. But mostly I sort of watched the great man interacting with other great men.
You know, somebody should write a book on the great men of American public service, these people who have dominated. Whether you think it's good or bad, Rickover, whom I knew, comes to mind, or others who are larger than life, who are larger than we think of public servants as being, or people in a departmental career as being.
But we don't want to forget that Dr. Bader served at the White House for 4 years in charge of China. Aside from being assistant to secretary.
The Holbrooke experience started me on China because we normalized diplomatic relations with China while I was working for him. And so I went into Chinese language training after that, and then I spent 20-odd years in the State Department and in the White House.
In the White House,
in charge of
were you
China
in the
relations.
National Security Council?
I was senior director under Obama.
Okay, well, now we know that we know everything that's to be known about China at the table, with China and with our own relationship. I don't believe that there's ever been any country that has grown as fast, even in the incredible early years of America, where you had this enormous expansion, and I am astounded by where they found the managerial talent when they had a system that was antithetical to breeding managers. What do you think about that?
Well, they didn't find it overnight, and they looked overseas initially. They, when Deng Xiaoping decided to open up, he was very keen to bring in foreign investment and foreign expertise, especially managerial expertise. And he did this, I think, knowing he was taking a risk. He said, you open a window, you're going to let in some flies. And we hear a lot now in American discussions of China about Chinese assertiveness, sometimes arrogance, bellicosity, but they got a lot of their managerial expertise through humility, through a real willingness to study foreign models and to send people overseas to look at best practices. So it's been one step forward, two steps back at times, but it's been a gradual and in many ways, I think, a humble and an impressive process of learning. Of studying.
We in Washington have watched the growth from their first diplomats who were very unsteady and poorly dressed and to very sophisticated people. But is there something odd about the speed of this? Why did we never, over the centuries, have any sense in the West of Chinese capacity?
Well, I think there's a few things. I mean, just to echo what Robert was saying, right now there are about 200,000 Chinese students in the United States still to this day. If you look at the Soviet Union at the peak of its strength, I don't know, they have virtually no students in the United States or in the West. So China's taken a completely different path. And the other thing that they've done recognized was that they had tremendous asset in all these overseas Chinese. So people in Taiwan, people in Hong Kong, and overseas Chinese throughout the world. If he could attract their interest in China, then China could piggyback, as it were, on their experiences, their knowledge, their capital. So a good deal of the tremendous transformation of China was Chinese coming home from overseas. Now, what has China done? I think of it as kind of a country going back to its DNA. China was always a profoundly entrepreneurial society. Capitalism comes naturally to China. Chinese are always...
I think it's almost impossible to explain to an American audience how entrepreneurial they are. I became most acutely aware by watching them in Vietnam, where the Vietnamese go 100 miles an hour, and then you go down to particularly in Ho Chi Minh City, the old Saigon, you go down to the Chinese area, and they're going 300 miles an hour. If you have a Clorox bottle, you have a gas station. If you have a hot plate, you own a restaurant. It's absolutely astounding. It's exhausting. But somehow this was missed on the world. It remains to me a sense of great curiosity about how the West, and particularly colonial powers in the West, and there was never a colonial power in the full sense in China, there was the British coastal incursion, that missed this potential for rivalry and just the skill of the people. I once took a coat hanger in Vietnam out of a closet, and I thought this beautiful carving. I thought, how did the French and later the Americans not understand how truly gifted these people are? And of course now we see this gift as a commercial, with China, as a commercial rivalry, and very soon China will have the largest economy. Does this mean that we're going to be natural rivals and ultimately military rivals in the pattern of the Soviet Union or the pattern of historically England and France and then England and Germany? Is that an inevitable human condition?
That's exactly the issue. So the first, as you said so well, we overlooked their goals, and now we flipped in the opposite direction. Suddenly the average Chinese is 10 feet tall, and they're going to, God protect us from straight line projections, assuming because they go like this, they will keep going like this. But above all is the issue just mentioned. So many of my colleagues discovered what they consider an iron law of history, that when one power rises and the old power is challenged, the old power doesn't yield fast enough, and a war inevitably ensues. So first of all, I don't think there are iron laws in history. The second, as my colleagues, scholars, historians pointed out, out of 15 such occasions since 1500, in 4 of them no war ensued. For instance, when the United States became a superpower. So the main question is at the moment not so much that there is an iron law, but the counter vision. The vision of confronting China is very clear. And that people, for good reasons, want to prepare for war for China just in case. There are industries who find an interest. There's some in the military, then they point to Chinese build-up, and they get to reciprocity. And so that vision is clear. The counter vision is very unclear. And what we think we need most is a vision of a very different kind of relationship. And that's where we came up with this a caption which needs a lot of fleshing out, that we want a mutually assured restraint, a play on a mutually assured destruction.
Or you want to get to a point where something else, the relationship is matured in a different way, as say the relationship between Europe and America,
Exactly.
which is, for all of when the European Union was going great guns and taking in, people were talking about Fortress Europe, but it was not a serious contender, either commercially, but especially militarily. It was no contender at all. That is possible. I mean, there is a fine historical example where there isn't what you might anticipate to be a tension and possibly a military tension. But one of the things we know in history is that when a country has internal problems, they tend to find an external thing, the Falklands, the Rock of Gibraltar, Spratly Islands, all is an external thing. And then, of course, China has Taiwan, a large externality for tension whenever they want to turn it up.
Well, not just Taiwan. More recently, they also have Japan, which is actually, I think, far more effective for Beijing in terms of turning on those spigots of manipulated but also very real, deep emotion. And so right now, our attention is on the East China.
Just for our viewers and listeners, you might just tell us the history of this tension between China and Japan.
Well, this goes, Japan had traditionally been a recipient of culture from China, and the Japanese are very good about admitting this to this day. The literate culture, gardens, painting, aesthetic traditions had come beginning in the Tang Dynasty, about 7th and 8th century, to Japan. And so China had always seen itself as the giver of civilization to a sort of a poor younger brother, as it were, until late in the 19th century, Japan shocked China and beat it in a naval war. And then far more dramatically in terms of the way that the Chinese think about Japan today, Japan then invaded China in 1937, particularly barbaric. I lived in Nanjing, China for 6 years, where what was called the Rape of Nanking took place in 1937. Mm-hmm. And this is something which happened, but the historiography of this has also been carefully controlled by the Chinese government, so that they keep a low burner on a certain kind of historical memory in China, so they can bring it up.
I find this subject fascinating, but we'll get too far off. How some countries keep the hate alive. I've done a lot of work and part of a think tank in Ireland, for example, where they've been kept the hate alive since William of Orange. And yet you have Germany and Britain having fought 2, and maybe you could count the Franco-Prussian War, 3 wars, and no hostility at all. I'll take a moment for station identification, primarily for the benefit of our listeners on Sirius XM Radio Channel 124. You're listening to White House Chronicle, coming to you from Washington, D.C., with myself, Llewellyn King, joined today by 3 people who are discussing China, 2 great experts, and our old friend on this broadcast. He is Amitai Etzioni. Our guests are Robert Daly from the Wilson Center, a diplomat and Chinese expert who has lived in China and is Chinese-speaking, and by another expert, also with extensive experience in China and work in the State Department and the White House, Jeffrey Bader, who's with the Brookings Institution, maybe the most revered of Washington think tanks. We're talking about the future, and essentially, will there be an unpleasant relationship between the U.S. and China? Is it going to be a Time Newsweek kind of battling for world domination, or will we live comfortably together in interdependence as Britain and Europe do? What is your thought on this?
Well, I agree with what Amitai said. I think, first of all, there is no iron law of history that says that because, Sparta and Athens had a problem that 2,000 years later we have to repeat that same pattern. In fact, our leaders, I think, have shown for the last 40 years that we're entirely capable of having a civil relationship. But it's a challenge. There's no question that China in the 21st century is going to be the one country in the world that has comprehensive power that in many ways rivals the U.S. The reason I'm relatively optimistic, if you compare it with, let's say, the Soviet experience, and most of the rivalries between rising powers and existing powers in the last 200 years, the ones that ended in war mostly had to do with imperialist powers on the rise that were expansionist.
Or ideological.
Soviet Union.
We've had no ideology out of China.
None. Okay, so their territorial aspirations are fairly modest and in the region. They claim lots and lots of islands and rocks in the South China Sea. They claim Taiwan. And they claim the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea. If you add that all up, you've got an area probably, I don't know, maybe the size of Washington, D.C., if you aggregated all the lands. So there are some potential frictions there. But this is not a country that's looking to impose its model on the rest of the world. It's not a country that really has spread political influence or is seeking to have an empire of satellites the way the Soviet Union did. So this is something we can navigate. In part, we have to get past the ideological.
I'd like to bring Amitai in here. You have thought a lot about this problem, and you talked to me about it, and you talked to other people about it, that, it's not a problem yet, but the incipient tension and military tension that there could be, which would be, in terms of manpower, is symmetrical, maybe not in terms of military technology at this point in time. And what's your feeling about this future relationship?
Well, we need not to flesh out this alternative concept of trying to resolve our difference in greater specificity. So, for instance, both sides are concerned about cyber weapons. The Chinese have offered a code of conduct, international conduct, in cyberspace. Actually, if somebody reads it and is not told it was written by China, you think it was written by the State Department. The exception of one line, which can be interpreted as censorship, the rest is very progressive. I'm not saying it's the answer, actually. I think the more important issue is kinetic weapons are not intelligent. But this is one example where we should be able to work out something to do. The question is, the nations on the border of China, Philippines, Vietnam, Burma, all those countries, are we going to give them all a trigger on our weapon, in effect, by making all kind of military commitments to them?
Have we not given Taiwan a trigger?
In effect, that's a very good example of my point. In effect, I think we developed an implicit understanding. They will not use force to integrate Taiwan, and we will not recognize Taiwan as an independent nation. It was never written down like this, but I think it's both implicit. And if you could make it a little more explicit, we would move another step away from confrontation.
Let's hear from both of our experts, Amitai, on the internal situation in China. I'm extremely interested in nuclear power and have been for many years. But the nuclear industry here is genuinely worried about the rate at which nuclear plants are being built in China, not because they don't trust the Chinese engineering, but the Chinese corruption. Will safety standards be lowered? Will bad aggregate, poor rebar, all of the things that go into a nuclear power plant, will there be cheating? Will there be brown envelopes substituting for inspections? It's called the gold standard. We're trying to export the American standard of nuclear safety, but it's a large concern. And if you have a country where you have pervasive corruption in big things, not petty corruption like, a consideration for the taxi driver to take an extra passenger, but big-time corruption, tens of millions of dollars, How undermining is this? Can China survive it, and can it eradicate it? Either of you?
Well, let me take a first shot at that. I mean, the basic problem China has is sources of energy. They're 70% reliant on coal. And we all know what China's cities look like. They have the 20 dirtiest cities in the world, like 17 are Chinese. And you have these complete blackouts from...
I've been in Beijing when it's really...
Yeah, it's dreadful. So they are looking for alternative sources. Plus, of course, they're the largest emitter of greenhouse gases now. So nuclear power is one of a number of attractive alternatives for them. And
not surprising, it's an ideal alternative. They build them safely, and the corruption doesn't underwrite.
So that's why they're going there. But I think your point is absolutely right. I mean, I think any reasonable person needs to have concern about the pace with which they are developing their nuclear industry. And Japan certainly had what we all thought was a gold standard nuclear industry until 2 years ago, when we've been dealing with the aftermath of Fukushima since then. So I think it's a reasonable concern.
What do you see the internal future?
Well, and the other side of the coin, obviously, corruption is a major problem. It's not just nuclear safety. It's food safety. It's traffic and transportation safety, construction safety, right across the board. But there's sometimes in American reporting on these issues in China, there's an implication that somehow the Communist Party, because they're inherently bad, they don't know and they don't care, which isn't true. They do know, and intelligent, hardworking people in China do care, and they do tend to distinguish between key industries or matters of national security. So can they eradicate corruption such that it's not a good question at all? No. But I do think that leadership in China is aware of the issue, and that they will pay particular attention to it in an area like nuclear, where they know what the dangers are. And they now have to respond, this is something else that's changed, to popular concerns. They can't not listen anymore with the internet. This is true in areas of public health, pollution, and certainly safety as well. So it's a big problem, but some of the trend lines give cause for hope, I would argue.
It's very difficult for the American public to understand, because the political forces here that will seize on any bad news out of China. Mm-hmm. For example, they're Islamists, and say, oh, see, it doesn't work. See, this is they're going to fall apart. The fact is, they look pretty cohesive, don't they? They don't look as like a country that's going to break into pieces.
But I think right? And it's going to be decided at a place which is least discussed, and that's these anti-ship missiles. Why is that so critical?
But wait a minute. Let's just, if we could just deal with the integrity of China.
Right.
Is that unquestioned?
Oh, in my mind, it's barely questioned. This is not the Soviet Union. You've got some minority peoples around the margins of the country.
So that's not an issue.
I don't see it.
And you've got very broad, nearly universal buy-in to continued economic development as the national project.
Okay. That answers that.
No, I'm happy to decide one before we move to the next one. The way our military sees it, and I think they have a good case, that China developed these new kind of weapons, which they have nice technical names, area denial, access denial. But basically, in the past, when there was a problem in the area, we could send 2 aircraft carriers positioned between Taiwan and mainland China, and that was enough to send a signal, hey, everybody's to call it. Maybe not every time, but most times. Now our military says they can blow those aircraft carriers out of the water, and very cheaply. They cost whatever, X billions. Those anti-ship missiles cost a few $100,000.
Well, this is the new asymmetry in warfare.
But
led by our producing weapons like drones that make established, especially battle groups, quite amazingly obsolete.
Exactly. So the question is then we said we have to go, in order to stop that, we have to hit the mainland, because that's where the anti-ship missiles are.
This is the air-sea battle.
Yeah, right. Now, once you go down that road, then, of course, their military reads our reports, which many of them not trust.
Well, this would assume that everything we want to avoid is taking place.
Exactly.
I would like to talk about Africa. As an African, I was born and grew up in Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia. I've been astounded by how the Chinese have penetrated Africa without firing a shot. At one point, they had a substantial foothold in 46 countries. I think they had a party in Beijing and had 46 heads of state, which most people cannot pull off. Is it just for, there are some problems now because, the Africans are not so happy with what they see as the new colonialism, although it's a very different pattern. Again, because the Chinese have not arrived with a religion or an ideology, they just want to take the mineral wealth and buy off the governments as they are. What's the future of them as a neo-colonial power, which is what they are if they have that much control of Africa?
Very worth watching, and sometimes as an American who's been accused by the Chinese many times of being imperialist, it's sort of pleasant to watch the shoe going on the other foot. But China's discovering what it means to be a great power. You wanted to be one, now you are. Congratulations. And they are finding increasingly that buying off the local powers, as you described it, is to buy in. That they can't quite be entirely innocent of ideology and entirely neutral as to what kinds of governments they support, because then they are seen, if the governments are seen as oppressors, they will be seen that way as well. They're finding that they have interests, they have security interests, they need to protect their people. And so the story, as I see it, changes year to year and will continue to do so.
I think one of the objectives of the U.S. over the last 30 years, since the opening of China, has been to draw China more and more into the international network of institutions, multilateral institutions, that set the rules for how we behave.
I just spent 3 days at a conference on carbon capture and sequestration, and the Chinese were substantial players there.
Yeah, they are playing. And so things like international standards on aid, international standards on investment, which are set by the OECD, which China is not a member of. These are standards that have been worked out by the major players over the last 30 years, and our goal has been to get China into the clubs rather than operating outside the clubs, so that they will accept the disciplines of these institutions. Now, once we let China in, they're going to want to change the rules somewhat. They're not going to simply accept the rules as written before, but it still will affect their conduct for the better, as it has, as they've joined the UN, the IMF, the World Bank. So I think that their conduct in Africa is problematic, but it can become more in conformity with what we regard as these international standards.
We're out of time. I'd like to do a farewell shout out to our new viewers at WSBE in Providence, Rhode Island, and indeed the whole state of Rhode Island. We shall be back next week on the same stations. We will see you then, and I thank these gifted gentlemen for joining me today. Adieu.
White House Chronicle is produced in collaboration with WHUT, Howard University Television. From Washington, D.C., this has been White House Chronicle, a weekly analysis of the news with insight and a sense of humor, featuring Llewellyn King, Linda Gasparello, and guests. This program may be seen on PBS stations and cable access channels. To view the program online, visit us at whitehousechronicle.com.